Hi, I'm Vance Ricks. My title at Northeastern is Teaching Professor of Philosophy and Computer Science. That means that I hold appointments in two different departments, the Department of Philosophy and Khoury College of Computing Sciences. Mostly what I do here is to teach courses on the ethical and social dimensions of emerging technologies, things like artificial intelligence. And also I'm working with people in the Align program to help design and develop ways of teaching those concepts in master's level courses, such as the ones that you would take in the Align program. So today I'm going to give some examples of what that would look like. Now, when we talk about artificial intelligence, that's really a broad term that covers a range of technologies. So think about that in the remarks that I'm about to make. Just we're not talking only about generative AI, we're talking about a bunch of stuff. But besides being really impressive technologically, those tools are also social cultural objects, right? So that is to say they have societal implications and cultural implications. And they affect our lives, in other words, not just because they're technologies, but because they help reshape our culture, they reshape our societies. They have effects on healthcare, on employment, on education, on how we live together. News media, for example, being another prominent example. So I want to give three particular ethical values and talk about what those values are, talk about some of the ways in which artificial intelligence systems can help us think about those values or maybe even reshape those values. I'm going to start by talking first about fairness and bias, then I'm going to talk about privacy, and then finally autonomy. Okay, let's start with fairness. Now, most of us from early childhood have a sense when things that we don't deserve happen to us, or when things that we do deserve don't happen to us, or maybe our sibling gets something and they get more of it than we did, and that's not fair, we think. So this idea of fairness, I think, is not something that we come to as adults. I think many of us from very early in life have a sense of fairness and unfairness. But what do those things actually refer to? One way that we talk about fairness and unfairness in the context of AI systems is connected to a term bias. So I want to talk about all of those things somewhat interchangeably. When we talk about fairness or unbiased or unfairness and bias, I'm going to be using those terms more or less the same. So let's think about the notion of bias. By itself, bias isn't a bad thing necessarily. Think about if you have a baby and you want someone to babysit that baby because you're going to be away, you probably have a bias in favor of a human babysitter over a cat babysitter. You probably have a bias in favor of someone who likes babies over someone who hates babies. So not every form of bias necessarily is bad. So when we're thinking about bias in general, but also bias in the context of AI systems, what I'm going to be focusing on are more the bad forms of bias, not just bias in general. And there are two different ways in which philosophers and political theorists and psychologists think about bias. So I'm going to talk about two of those ways and then try to connect those to artificial intelligence systems. One form of bias is what's called allocative or distributive. These are forms of bias in which someone doesn't get something to which they were entitled, or they do get something that they weren't entitled to. It's about how things are distributed. So if someone is getting more money for the same job that their coworker in the cubicle next to them who has just as much experience, just as much background, and is doing just as much work, right? That might be a form of distributive bias if we're talking about how the money in the form of the salary or benefits is distributed between the two of them. Or if some people in the same society have more voting rights or more political rights than other people do, and they're the same age, etc., that might also be a form of allocative bias. So you can see the harms that are involved in that form of bias or that form of unfairness, right? Because something you deserve is being withheld from you, or something that you didn't deserve is being given to you. And so that might harm the person who didn't get the thing that you got. But there's a different way that we might think about bias that's also relevant in the context of artificial intelligence systems. And that is known as representational bias. Representational bias occurs when people are represented in ways that show them as somehow less than. So perhaps less intelligent, less competent, less entitled to respect, perhaps being portrayed as unfairly clownish or unfairly fill in the blank. So different ways of representing a group or a member of a group might count as a form of bias. So I want to talk now about how each of these shows up or could show up as we think about artificial intelligence systems. Let's focus first on distributive or allocative forms of bias in the context of AI systems. As many of you know, artificial intelligence systems are being used in a variety of places in our society to help screen job resumes, to help make decisions about who should be arrested, to help make decisions about who should be eligible for medical benefits or surgery, to help decide which neighborhood should be invested in or which student should be admitted to school. So in every aspect of your life or the life of someone you know, some sort of AI system is probably helping to analyze data and arrive at a decision about something relevant to your life. So one of the things that we know about many of these systems is that they were trained on data from past decisions, all of which were made by humans, all of which were made in different ways that reflected the social biases of those times. So one of the ways in which a current AI system might continue to reflect those biases is by the data on which it was trained being taken as a projection about how the future should also look. So there's a way in which, for example, decisions about jobs and who gets jobs that may have been made in eras when certain people weren't given equal access to those jobs will mean that when the system is crunching numbers and looking at qualities that make someone more qualified for a job or less qualified, those are going to be based on historical patterns. And so if all we do is rely on what that system says, then we risk importing those patterns into the future and perpetuating them. Let's talk now about an example of representational bias. One thing that people have done just for fun sometimes is to use an AI system, maybe a Stable Diffusion model that can generate images, let's say, and ask it to show me an example of a person from such and such country, or show me an example of a corporate executive. And so there could be different forms of bias that show up there too in what is portrayed, right? What is portrayed as a typical college professor? What is portrayed or who is portrayed as an American woman? How does the portrayal of someone give the viewer or the listener some sense of what is, quote, normal and what is, quote, abnormal or atypical? This also shows up in the ways that, for example, large language models are trained. Many of them are trained primarily, at least in the context of the United States, this makes sense, they're trained primarily on English language, literature and videos and sound. And so what that also means is perhaps if you use a different form of English or if you speak a different language that's not English, and many of the world's dominant large language models right now are trained mostly on English language data, then it could be that your entire linguistic community is left out of the ability to benefit from the use of large language models. And so that's another potential form of representational bias. Next, we're going to talk about privacy. Now, for some people, privacy is a kind of umbrella term, and there are a lot of other things that are under that umbrella, things like confidentiality, things like obscurity, things like secrecy. Other people say, no, there's just one thing, privacy. We don't have to settle that debate today, but one of the things that I can do is talk about some of the things that people have said are valuable about privacy, whether we think about it as just one concept or as a whole bunch of different concepts. So I'm going to focus on a couple of things. One of them is intimacy. Psychologists and philosophers have argued that one of the things that's important to all of us is the possibility of intimate relationships. And they don't necessarily mean physical intimacy, they also mean emotional and psychological intimacy, being able to open up to someone and trust them. And they have suggested that one of the things that is valuable about privacy is that it makes that kind of intimacy possible. So let's think about a different world. Think about a world in which every single person knew just as much information about you as every other person. Now, in that world, it would really be difficult to have someone whom you considered a friend, because part of what friendship is a relationship in which that person knows you in a way that other people don't. Or they may know things about you that other people don't. Or they may know things about you that those other people also know, but the difference is you told them those things versus those other people looked up those things about you on Google. or some other search engine. So the risk then, if we try to undermine privacy, is that we risk undermining the capacity to have those sorts of close relationships, right? To be able to decide whom we're going to disclose things to and on what basis. But the main value that often comes up in discussions of privacy is security. Many people think about the risks that they may face if, for example, someone discovers one of their passwords, or if someone discovers some potential embarrassing fact about them. And they think about privacy in the context of secrecy. So that is the ability to hide things that may be uncomfortable, that may put you at risk, that may make you vulnerable in some way. And so another reason that people sometimes talk about valuing privacy is they see it as being connecting to protecting themselves from ways in which they might be vulnerable. Now, often in discussions of privacy, there's a particular argument that comes up, which is called the nothing to hide argument. I'm just going to write down that phrase. And the idea is that if you don't have anything to hide, then you don't really have a reason to care about privacy, right? The idea there is that privacy, again, is for people who want to hide things that might be embarrassing, might be criminal, perhaps they're up to no good. And so if you're standing on privacy as something that you think everyone should have, then maybe that should make the rest of us suspicious of you. But if we take just a couple of moments to think about that more deeply, we can see that that's not really correct. First of all, most of us behave in ways that show that we do want to conceal things that we don't think are embarrassing or illegal or immoral. Any of you who uses passwords, if you have a door that you close and lock, if you have window shades, maybe you're planning a surprise party. We can imagine all kinds of contexts in which people want to be able to limit the kinds of access that people have to them or to information about them for all kinds of benign reasons, right? Not just for bad ones. Another thing to think about, though, is whether you have nothing to hide sort of depends on who's watching. And you may not want to subject your behavior and values to their judgment. Perhaps a different government comes into power than the one that you were expecting. Or perhaps you're in a work environment or some other kind of environment where people have standards that are somewhat different from yours. So just because you don't think you're doing anything wrong, that doesn't mean that the people who are watching or who are looking at your information agree with you about that. And so that leads to the idea that privacy isn't just necessarily a good thing for us individually, it may also be a good thing for us collectively. So let's talk about ways in which AI systems may imperil some of the things that we value about privacy. One way in which they might do that is simply because they are connected to what are called big data systems. These are large computer systems that are capable of crunching numbers and crunching information on a scale that's beyond human capacity. That also means these systems are able to find correlations between different bits of information that a human would take a long time, if ever, to be able to discover. So that implies that something that you think is a irrelevant, tiny, trivial fact about you might in fact be used to infer some other things about you that are less trivial or less significant, or more significant, right? That could result in effects to your healthcare, to your employment, to all kinds of things. And so because of the scale on which these systems operate, their ability to make those connections means that there isn't any such thing necessarily as a fact about you that's irrelevant or information about you that's irrelevant. Another way in which we can see systems based on AI technologies, perhaps imperiling our privacy, is illustrated by things like facial recognition technologies. And so again, this is connected to the idea of big data, where the ability to see a face, to connect it to information about the owner of that face, and then to make other kinds of inferences about that person and to act on that, means that, in effect, no one can just be out in the world and be an anonymous person, right? A face is not something that you can easily change. And even if you try to cover it with a mask or some other sort of disguise, many systems are better and better at sort of penetrating those disguises, again, simply because of the sheer quantity of data that they have available. So whether we think that facial recognition technologies are overall good things for society or not, we won't resolve that here, but it is a potential threat. Finally, let's talk about autonomy. Autonomy is a mashup of two Greek terms that effectively means self-governing or self-legislating. And the idea is, on a basic level, we can think about autonomy as doing what you want. Now, I put a question mark next to that because one of the things that, as you reflect on this idea of doing what you want, may come to mind is, well, where do my wants come from? Think about how many of our deep needs and wants stem from childhood. Well, did you have a choice about where you were going to be born or who your parents were going to be or what the psychological or emotional state of those parents was going to be or whether there was a war going on when you were growing up? No, you probably didn't have a choice over most of that stuff. So the idea of your ability to do what you want when you step back and think about it also means you have to think about where your wants come from. And so a different way that people think about autonomy is not just doing what you want, but also wanting what you want. You might find that there are certain things you want and you kind of wish you didn't. Maybe you wish you weren't so easily influenced by your friends or by the larger society. Maybe you wish you could stand up for yourself a little more often. Maybe you wish you could reflect more before you acted. Maybe you want to be a less reactive person, for example. So autonomy, in other words, has multiple dimensions, right? So it's not just about the ability to act, but it's also about the ability to take a step back and reflect on, well, why did I act in that way? Could I act in a different way? The ability, in other words, to try to shape yourself. And so that's an ongoing, lifelong project, right? And there are lots of obstacles that we all face individually and collectively as we try to become more autonomous or less autonomous. And so as I'm talking about autonomy here, I'm not talking about autonomous systems like self-driving cars or weapons that shoot themselves. But there's a different way in which human-level autonomy is relevant as we're thinking about AI systems. So I want to talk about two of those ways right now. One of them is one that we're all familiar with. That's personalization. So even before generative models, there was an older form of AI technology called recommender engines and recommender systems. So we're all familiar with this from using search engines, from using, if you have a streamer service, whether it's serving you songs or serving you videos, right? It sort of, quote, pays attention to what you like and what you behave, how you behave, and then makes recommendations for what you might like watching or what you might want to listen to in the future. So personalization, well, how could that be a threat to autonomy? It sounds like it's actually enhancing my autonomy, right? It's giving me more of what I want to listen to as opposed to recommending me songs that I'm not going to be interested at all. So what is the potential risk here? So I do want to acknowledge, yeah, that is a good thing, right? We typically want more of what we want and less of what we don't want. So one of the potential things to worry about, or to think about at least in the context of AI systems, is what's the basis on which they're making these recommendations? Are they narrowing our tastes? Are they making it harder for us to explore other things that we might come across at random? So in the olden times, right, you used to be able physically to browse in a bookstore or at a record store, and it's harder to do that online. It's not quite the same experience. And so that means sometimes we have to exert a little extra effort to find things that are off the beaten path. So one potential risk of recommender systems is that on the one hand, personalization makes us feel as though, yes, we're getting more of what we want, but it may also make it harder for us to step back and ask whether that's in fact what we want. A second phenomenon is called nudging. Nudging is connected to a phenomenon known as paternalism. Paternalism is the idea that you're making a judgment for someone else's good. Now, in the literal case of being someone's parent, right, you have a moral and an ethical and a societal obligation to make decisions on behalf of people who are too young to know what's good for them, or who might put themselves in real danger if you just let them do what they wanted. And the idea is that as someone gets older, it becomes less and less appropriate for you to make decisions on that person's behalf. So one thing that AI systems are able to do is maybe to influence the kinds of decisions that we make. So how might they do that? I'm going to give two examples. Let's think first of all about generative models. Most of these are based on, or chatbots that are connected to generative models, right? These are conversational agents. And so they use things like the first person pronoun. They say things like I. They give a sense, in other words, that they are an agent that you're interacting with in the sense of a conscious being, something that has a kind of consciousness, an awareness, perhaps even some sort of emotional capacity. And so we already see this happening, that people are turning to conversational agents for therapeutic purposes, to pour their hearts out, but then also to get life advice. These are corporate products, right? They're corporately made and corporately owned. And so we can assume on the one hand that these are not designed intentionally to cause harm, but we also know that they're not intentionally built for therapeutic purposes that are actually meant to serve the interests of the person they're interacting with. A different form of nudging we can think about in the context of AI systems is simply that, like social media generally, many AI systems that we interact with in the form of conversational models are designed to engage us. And they're designed to get us to spend as much time using them as possible. So even in cases where you find yourself not wanting to spend that much time, these things are designed to be very attractive and very hooky. And we may find that a lot of time has passed and we didn't realize how much time we had spent. And again, that's partly because of how they're designed, right? So they're nudging in a way that doesn't say explicitly, I want to capture your attention and have you spend as much time using this as possible, but they're designed in ways that make them really appealing and attractive to use. So I've given a brief overview of a couple of ethical values that I think are really important to most of us, and about some of the ways in which they interact and intersect with the uses and design of AI systems. Now, I don't want to imply that AI systems only pose dangers to these values. And one of the things that I think is great about a program like the Align program and the work that we're doing there is that it's an opportunity for you to reflect broadly on what are ways in which, given that these are things that we care about, we can design systems that help us actually to avoid the bad kinds of bias, to preserve and protect the kinds of privacy that we care about, to help promote autonomy, all of in the service of human flourishing. So again, I think technologies are ways for us actually to live out our values, and not just cool things for us to play with. And that's a lesson that runs throughout the program here. So to learn more about any of this, please check out Khoury College.